In the late 1980s, Boston was experiencing a wave of violence the city had never seen before. Police and first responders were on the scene multiple times a day cleaning up the aftermath. When one super group of different streets, hoods, and projects began clicking up, it put pressure on the remaining hoods to do the same. What resulted was a clash of two super crews of aligned hoods, and it turned the Boston streets into a dangerous battlefield. What's up, everybody? Welcome back. So let's take a step back into time, the 1980s to be exact, which just so happens to be the most dangerous period in the city of Boston's history. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, Boston earned a reputation as a tough, run-down, industrial, blue-collar, kind of classic northern East Coast city like New York City, Baltimore, Philadelphia, most of the cities, New Jersey. Even though mostly known for their Irish and Italian organized crime figures, Boston had a sizable black community with over 100,000 residents, more than 20% of the city's overall population. The South End and Lower Roxbury were the original heart of Black Boston, but soon Mattapan, Jamaica Plain, and large parts of Dorchester neighborhood became synonymous with Boston's black community. All the way back in the 1950s, maybe even the late 1940s, there were various neighborhood and street crews in the black neighborhoods of the South End and Roxbury, just as there were Irish crews in Southie, Charlestown, Dorchester, Italians in Eastie in the North End, Jewish kids in the West End, etc. During the 1960s, the first organized groups began to operate in Boston's black areas, most notably the Campbell brothers, who were a force in the city until the 1970s, controlling the majority of the H trade in town. They had made an alliance with the deadly Johnny Martirano of the Winter Hill organization. When players came to Boston from Detroit in the late 1960s to make inroads into Boston's H trade with local dealers and push the Campbell brothers out, Martirano helped the Campbells eliminate their competition. This isn't the only connection I've come across between Detroit and Boston either. Apparently in the late 1970s, a group from Detroit that was connected to the infamous YBI, or Young Boys Incorporated, came to the notorious Columbia Point housing projects in Dorchester. An underling of Dwayne Wonderful Wayne Davis, one of the founders of YBI, came to Columbia Point with a small amount of product and set up a beachhead for the organization. He was able to flip it fast and turn a considerable profit. What went for $20 in the saturated city of Detroit could go to upwards of $100 in Boston. There was plenty of users in Boston, but a limited supply. Seeing the potential, the Detroit guys increased their presence in the Point. Columbia Point was in a completely isolated part of Dorchester away from most of the other neighborhoods. It quickly became overrun with crime, and because of its isolation and one way in, one way out, police didn't like to enter unless they were deep in numbers. This was in the early 1980s, in a time when the streets of Boston, especially in the black sections of the city, were beginning to change. Different neighborhoods were beginning to form crews, street by street, project by project. The Columbia Point Dogs were one of the most feared crews in Boston's history, and they formed around this time. I've heard that some of the original members of CPD were connected to these Detroit hustlers who were pushing H in the projects. Some of them even traveled to Detroit and worked as muscle for YBI members like Wonderful Wayne Davis. Now, street legend has it that the first neighborhood really to come together as a hood and start repping hard was Corbett Street in Dorchester. Many of the Johnsons, who were a legendary family from Corbett, repped the crew, including Anthony Johnson, who was also a member of the iconic Boston rap group The Almighty RSO with Ray Benzino. But in June of 1988, Anthony's life was tragically ended when he was just 21 years old. It would come at the hands of a feared member of the Academy Homes housing project in Roxbury, known on the street as LL. Apparently it wasn't a hood beef, it was over a female. Let's backtrack for a second here though, because there was a dramatic shift in the 1980s. Like I said, throughout the 60s and 70s, Boston was a rough city with plenty of violence spread throughout, but in the mid-1980s this intensified dramatically. This was a story throughout the entire country in this particular period, but in Boston, levels of violence like this had never been seen before, and certainly never since. I doubt Boston will ever see a period like this in its history ever again, like the late 1980s and early 1990s. By the mid-80s, many of the crews on the street were already beginning to form. Individual streets, hoods, projects were beginning to create their own identities, more often than not taking on the moniker of a sports team like the Orchard Park Trailblazers, Humboldt Raiders, Highland Blackhawks, Franklin Hill Giants, and Greenwood Packers, etc. So when the catalyst for this huge explosion of violence occurred in the mid-1980s, there was already, and I'll say, a very unique street culture forming in the black and brown communities of Boston. The catalyst of which I speak was when a smokable form of a popular South American product hit the American streets like a Category 5 hurricane. Instead of being mostly consumed by wealthy and the disco crowd, now it was being sold in almost every American city for as low as a couple dollars a pop. The hard stuff first started to appear in parts of Roxbury and Dorchester in late 1985, early 86, but by the end of 1986 it was all over the city. Once again, businessmen from other cities tried to capitalize on Boston's booming market. Daryl Whiting, aka God, came up to the notorious Orchard Park housing projects in Roxbury and set up a small beachhead in a single mother's apartment and began to sell hard. Slowly, his New York boys started coming up to Boston, just a couple at a time, in one carload, then another. They made peace with the local OP Trailblazers, cutting a deal where they would only sell hard while the Trailblazers controlled the Bud, Soft, and H in the projects. Soon the dirt road, referred to as Bump Road, that led into Orchard Park, was full 24/7 with customers driving in and out of the projects. It was estimated during the height of their operation, God and the New York boys were making upwards to $100,000 a day off their sales. God was a larger-than-life character and was revered by many Orchard Park youths. He wore designer fashions, large jewelry, and drove a brand-new Mercedes-Benz. God did put back a lot of money into the community with legit businesses and funded many trips for the project's youth to amusement parks and was responsible for some of Boston's earliest hip-hop shows. Just because God and the New York boys made connections in Orchard Park didn't mean the New York boys were welcomed in every project in Boston. Apparently, they tried to set up shop at the infamous Atlantic projects and were promptly evicted. What's up, guys? So I'm just gonna pop in here real quick, and I'm just gonna ask you something. I don't ask very much, you guys. I put a lot of time and effort in these videos, try to do the best I can with the research. I don't go on lives and try to, beg money from you guys and stuff like that. All I'm asking you guys is to please just try to watch this video and just listen to what I'm saying and enjoy the video. Don't be like hair trigger just waiting for him to say something wrong and screw up so I can comment on it and be like, ha ha. I don't know, guys. It's just lately the comments have been like just pretty wild. Obviously there's a lot of positive stuff. People support my channel, have always supported it and stuff, and I got a lot of new subscribers the past month or so. But it's just like it's not even just with my channel. I just see it in general, man. Everybody is like real tense lately. And I know things are hard, man. Believe me, I'm suffering too. I got 2 little kids. I'm barely making ends meet. So let's just all just kind of try to give each other like a little break. Be a little bit nicer to each other. Just because things are tough, man. They're tough for most people. So I don't know, man. I'm not trying to preach here, really. I'm just saying, like, taking things out on each other ain't gonna make anything any better. So I don't know. Just so please, if you can for me, just try to listen to what I'm saying. I know I'm a little white boy from the North Shore. What do I know about SCAT-G and UPS? Not much really, except for what people tell me and what I find through my research. But nobody talks about this stuff, and there's such a crazy, in-depth street culture and history in the city of Boston and Massachusetts in general, and nobody knows about it. And everybody clowns on us and thinks like we're something that we're not. I mean, we're changing fast into something that we never were, but they don't really respect and understand like the history of what took place here. So I'm just trying to accurately depict it. That's all I'm trying to do. You can hate on me personally if you want. I understand. I learned that very early in this YouTube process that it's not about me. It's about like what I'm talking about. And if you want to not like me personally, that's fine, but don't kill the messenger. Boston definitely doesn't get the same notoriety as cities like New York, Chicago, LA, Detroit, or even smaller cities like St. Louis, Baltimore, and Oakland, but for almost 10 years, especially from 1988 to 93, Boston was one of the most dangerous cities in America. In 1990 alone, almost every other day, a person lost their lives to street violence. That's pretty much unfathomable only 35 years later when there's barely double-digit bodies, let alone triple digits. Boston in the late 1980s wasn't quote-unquote sweet like some other places in America. The late 80s and early 90s was when the street culture started to really explode in the United States. Through rap music and movies, the street culture really started to reach people in places it would have never been before. Pre-internet, people were mostly unaware how other folks in different parts of the country lived. This was at a time when many of these giant street organizations were beginning to franchise, if you will, throughout the country. Most notably, the GDs, Vice Lords, and Latin Kings, among others, that originated in the Windy City, had spread throughout the Midwest and beyond. But the most famous street organizations in America, and really the whole world, were the Blue and Red Street Crews of Los Angeles, California. By the early 1990s, there were California sets of Blue and Red on the East Coast, especially in New Jersey cities, and then the UBN made their move in the New York penal system, and in the later part of the decade, they took over the streets as well. But this didn't happen in Boston. Now currently there are all these groups in the city, but back in the late 80s and early 1990s, there was none of it. Boston was about as thorough of a city as it gets, and the neighborhood crews weren't about to let these outsiders set up shop on their turf. Throughout the fall of 1988, the violence was getting completely out of control. In a little over a month's period of time in October in an area around Roxbury and Dorchester, there were over 100 incidents involving firearms. That's in like over 3 a day. The police and city leaders didn't know what to do and had never seen anything like this before. Many of the incidents on the streets involved young men in their teens and early 20s. Many of the abuse began over normal adolescent things like females or a simple disagreement, but with the drastic uptick in violence, the seriousness of these squabbles became life and death. With the dangerousness increasing every day on the Boston streets and more hoods clicking up, alliances began. Some of these hoods were small single streets, others were massive public housing projects, so to even the playing field, a lot of the hoods started aligning. This is similar to what happened in LA in the 1970s when Raymond Washington on the east side hooked up with Tookie Williams on the west side, and the neighborhood after neighborhood started to rock blue. Then the remaining hoods felt the pressure and started banding together, rocking the color red. In 1989, a similar thing happened on the Boston streets, but the difference was there wasn't any blue or red in the bean. The two major supergroups were SCAT-G and UPS. SCAT-G, which stood for the St. Joseph's Housing Projects in Roxbury, Castlegate Road, the feared Academy Homes, the Eggleston Timberwolves. The T could also stand for the Tremont Street side of the Alliance, which is the Ruggles Street Projects, Rockets, Madison Park Village, the Shawmut Ave Indians, and the Tent City Twins. I've heard people argue whether the S stood for Shawmut Ave or the St. Joseph's Homes, but apparently they were both part of the Alliance, and the G was the Franklin Hill Giants and the Greenwood Street Packers. Now, on the other side of the equation was the mysterious UPS, aka the United Posse Syndicate or United Posse Society. I doubt you'll hear about this anywhere else on the internet, certainly not before I made this video, which I might quickly add for anyone who wants to crack jokes on me for getting any minute detail wrong or for talking about this when I wasn't physically a part of it. At least I'm trying to tell these stories. Before I started my channel, no one was talking about this stuff and what was really going on in Boston and Massachusetts, and for the few people that wish for it to remain in obscurity, they seem to be far outweighed by those that seem to enjoy me telling these stories. The video I made last year about all the different hoods and what sports teams they identified with is definitely the only video you're going to find on the internet with that type of information, certainly before I released that video. So with that being said, UPS had some of the most notorious and feared hoods in Boston in this alliance. Feeling the pressure from SCAT-G spreading throughout the Boston streets, feared Intervale Street and the legendary Corbett Street began reaching out to other hoods who weren't with SCAT-G. Mission Hill, Orchard Park, and the Heath Street Projects, aka Heat Street, were all cool at this time, which is kind of funny because now Heath Street hates OP and Mission Hill. But in 1989, they were cool. They ended up siding with Interville and Corbett to form UPS, and then shortly after, the Vamp Hill Kings joined, as well, sharing similar enemies with OP, Mission Hill, and Heath Street. Other powerhouse hoods like the Humboldt Raiders, who was bitter enemies with Castlegate, joined UPS, along with Warren Gardens, Bragdon Street, and the Walnut Park Dogs. The Highland Blackhawks ended up joining SCAT-G because they were fierce rivals of the OP Trailblazers, and even the mysterious X-Men were down with the Alliance. Being in such close proximity to the Academy Homes and being cool with the Eggleston Timberwolves, they sided with SCAT-G. At the height of its power, the SCAT-G Alliance had over 700 members. UPS was close to that number as well. This was no small feud, including well over 1,000 active members hunting for their enemies on the Boston streets 24/7. It's not surprising that in the year after SCAT-G and UPS formed in 1990, Boston had its most violent year on record with 152 bodies. Now that's a crazy figure on its own, but when you put it next to last year's 37 in 2023, it's really insane how out of control the city was during this time period. There were two main powers driving the SCAT-G and UPS rivalry, the backbone, if you will. It was the feared Academy Homes, who wore Braves gear, and the dreaded Heath Street Projects, aka Heat Street, who wore Miami Heat gear. These two massive housing developments were locked into a heated feud that intensified from 1989 to around 1994. The conflict became so intense that it basically split Boston street culture in half. Academy and Heath Street were two of Boston's deepest hoods and had soldiers for days. As the beef between these two hoods escalated, it forced smaller hoods to pick a side and seek powerful allies. When Academy started clicking up with other hoods in SCAT-G, smaller hoods like Bragdon Street saw the writing on the wall and reached out to Academy's enemies like Heath Street. It was an incredibly hectic and violent time. It was green light on sight if you saw your enemy. And with all these hoods being in such close proximity to each other, a quick walk to the store could turn into a deadly incident. No wonder why this was Boston's most violent period on record. Now, I definitely think it's worth noting that large powerhouse hoods of Lennox and the Columbia Point Dogs didn't directly get involved in the SCAT-G UPS rivalry. Officially, they remained neutral like Switzerland, but really Columbia Point favored SCAT-G in their interest, seeing as many of their rivals were part of UPS. Lennox was pretty much the same, but on the opposite side. They weren't part of UPS, but they certainly favored UPS over SCAT-G, which was affiliated with many of their enemies. Not only was the violence out of control compared to today's standards, but the landscape itself looked completely different from when it does today. Pre-gentrification, the projects and hoods in Boston were rough. You could feel the energy in the old bricks. The old Academy Homes projects were huge and physically imposing. The old Columbia Point projects were like some sort of poverty fortress. My father and his family lived there in the early 1950s. Also Orchard Park, Lenox, the old Mission Hill bricks. If you're interested in this stuff, go check out my man's channel, Mass Throwbacks. I watch his stuff all the time. He's got really cool old footage of Boston's hoods and projects from all over the 20th century. There were also the old Orange Line at Eggleston Square before they took down the elevated train. When people would come in by tea, you would see all the old buildings with the graffiti. It was quite a sight. The streets were in utter chaos. SCAT-G and UPS were in full-scale conflict with all the individual hoods and their alliances and rivalries. The city was a vast, interconnected web of these feuds. Guys were really getting normalized to the violence. The revenge crimes going back and forth, tit for tat, were adding up. Some of the young guys on the street were using what they were selling as well, and it didn't help their mental state. It made guys impulsive and more often than not, more prone to violence. Like the feared stepper from Academy, LL, who killed Anthony Johnson of Corbett in 1988. He admitted to authorities that he did like 6 bags of brown every morning, smoked hard and bud throughout the day, and did brown again at night while putting in work for the set every day. He also kicked down a door of a family member who was a BPD member and stole their service weapon. I'm just trying to paint a picture of what some of these kids were like during this time period out there on the street causing havoc. By 1994, the alliances were beginning to strain. Natural allies that had been made over the years, like Academy Homes, Castlegate, also Academy and Franklin Hill. I guess over the years, many families had moved back and forth between the different hoods. They had very deep roots. Greenwood Street and Franklin Hill were also very close. Hoods like the Highland Blackhawks jumped aboard, kind of for convenience, having a heated beef with the Orchard Park Trailblazers. The Eggleston Timberwolves, Academy, and X-Men all hung out in the same area more or less, and they became cool with each other. The X-Men began to phase out though in the early to mid-90s. A 19-year-old member, Hector Morales, was killed after an altercation with the Boston police when 2 officers were hurt. Somehow I think guys from Castlegate were involved as well. The graffiti crew turned street crew reformed into a new generation Dominican crew, Boylston Street, in the later part of the 90s. On the other side, in Lower Roxbury in the South End, Shawmut Ave, Masson Park, Ruggles, 1850 and the Tent City Twins all stood together against their hated rivals OP and Mission Hill. They would form their own thing over in that area after the SCAT-G alliance broke down in the mid-90s and held down their spot. In the late 90s, St. Joe's and the Academy Homes would fall out, and throughout the decade, St. Joe's would become friendly with their former ops like Orchard Park, the Walnut Dogs, and the Humboldt Raiders. St. Joe's also went head-to-head with Castlegate Road in the same time period. Seems like they just kind of switched up on all their allies. That's what it seems like. It was an incredibly treacherous time period with hoods changing alliances, sometimes on multiple occasions within a few-year time period, made the streets even more chaotic than ever. Now, on the other side, in UPS, Interval Street would end up falling out with Orchard Park and Heath Street, causing them to become enemies. Interval, realizing OP and Heath Street were much too powerful for them alone, formed MIC with the Magnolia Steelers and Columbia Road. They also had major smoke with the Brunswick Big Head Boys, who allied with Heath Street and Orchard Park. Then the Humboldt Raiders, who were part of UPS, would end up falling out with Orchard Park and Heath Street. In the late 90s, early 2000s, Humboldt disintegrated and H-Block came about. They had major beef with Heath Street and Orchard Park, most certainly Heath Street, and they switched their alliances, becoming friendly with Academy, who they used to be enemies with. They also became tight with Mission Hill. These alliances and rivalries would go on and keep changing and morphing with every new generation or just even when a couple years had passed. It's hard for anyone to keep track of this. It's incredibly complicated and complex, but I think it's important to try to paint a picture of what the streets in Boston were really like during this incredibly turbulent and chaotic time period in the city's history. I don't get everything right, but for the most part, I think my research is pretty thorough, and I think I accurately depict what it was really like in the city during the emergence of these 2 super street organizations in the wild 1980s and 90s in Boston. Every street, hood, and project was a war zone, and if you wore the wrong hat or sports apparel, you could most certainly lose your life. So I end the video on that note, and I do think it's very important. It's really honestly one of the big reasons why I started this channel, because A, there's nothing really on the internet and YouTube about what was really going on in Boston, actually depicts what the street culture and history of Boston and Massachusetts was really like. All you hear about is Whitey and some stuff about Italian guys and stuff like that, Charlestown bank robbers, which is all real, but there's so much more. So, and plus now, if you drive into the city or take a train to the city, the landscape is completely different. So you have no idea what Boston was really like during this time period. So those are big reasons. I want people to really know what things are like, because the media portrays Boston in a certain way. People across the country have a certain view of what they think Boston and Massachusetts really is, and it's very skewed. It's not really real. So I try to accurately depict what the real history was like, what the streets were really like, what people were going through. Like, this stuff was crazy. The late 80s and 90s were crazy in Boston. It's really not debatable. You know, people want to say it wasn't like this, it wasn't like that, but it was what it was, and it was pretty wild. So, hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, you know what to do. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. But most importantly, make good decisions, make good choices, take good care of yourselves, your family, your friends, your fellow human beings. Try to have a nice day, guys. I'll talk to you guys soon. God bless.